2 years. That is how long a dead woman waited in the ground at Coimbra before the man who loved her became powerful enough to do something about it. She had been murdered on the 7th of January, 1355, 3 men, a knife, a monastery garden, and at least one of her small children watching. Her name was Inés de Castro, and she was buried fast and quietly in the church of Santa Clara, the way you bury an embarrassment. And for 2 years the kingdom moved on, because that is what kingdoms do. The man who ordered her death sat on his throne. The man who loved her had no power to answer it. Then the old king died, and the man who loved her became King Pedro I of Portugal. And everything that had been buried, the marriage, the murder, the woman herself, came back up out of the ground. And the most famous thing people will tell you about her almost certainly never happened. That's the strange shape of this story. The part everyone remembers is probably a myth, and the part that's true is stranger, quieter, and built to last about 600 years longer than the lie. Here's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to separate the legend from the record carefully, because both are beautiful and only one is real. We'll follow a love affair. The crown tried to end with 3 knives, a revenge so exact it became the king's nickname. A marriage that may exist only because one grieving man swore it did. And 2 tombs that still sit in a Portuguese monastery, facing each other, waiting for the end of the world. By the end, you'll know which parts to believe, and you'll understand why the true version is the one that should frighten you. Everything here comes from people who wrote it down at the time, or close to it. The royal chronicler, Fernão Lopes, who gave her story chapter after chapter of his history, and the stone itself, which is still there and can still be read. When the record turns to legend, I'll stop and tell you. That line matters more in this story than in almost any other. Begin with the girl, because the girl is almost the only part nobody dramatised. Inés de Castro was born around 1325 in Galicia, in the northwest corner of the Iberian Peninsula. The daughter of a prominent Galician noble house, with ties through illegitimacy to both the Portuguese and Castilian royal lines, and by most accounts of illegitimate birth herself. In 1340, at roughly 15, she came to the Portuguese court in the entourage of Constança Manuel, the new wife of the heir to the throne, Prince Pedro, traditionally described as her lady-in-waiting. Look closely at that arrangement, because it's the engine of everything. A young woman is placed in the household of a princess to attend the wife of the man she will fall in love with. The court built the trap and then acted surprised when it closed, because Pedro fell in love with Inés, not quietly, not briefly. The chronicles describe a man undone, and here we have to be honest about a gap in the record, the first of several. We know almost nothing about what Inés herself felt, in her own words. No letter from her survives, no diary, no recorded speech, nothing in her own hand. Everything we know about the most famous woman in Portuguese history comes to us through the men who loved her, killed her, or wrote about her afterward. She is at the centre of the story, and she never gets to speak in it. That silence is going to cost something later. We'll come back to it. For years, the affair was the kingdom's open secret. Then Constança died in the late 1340s after childbirth. The exact year still argued over by historians, and instead of cooling, the thing got more dangerous, because now there was no wife in the way, and Inés was no longer just a scandal. She was a political problem with a Castilian accent. This is the part the love story leaves out, and it's the part that got her killed. Inés had brothers, powerful, ambitious Castilian brothers, and Pedro, besotted, generous, careless, began handing them positions and influence at the Portuguese court. To the old king, Afonso IV, this looked like exactly one thing: a foreign family quietly working its way toward the throne through his love-struck son. He had spent his reign keeping Castile out of Portugal. Now it appeared to be walking in the front door on his heir's arm, So the king did the cold arithmetic that powerful men do, and reached the answer that powerful men reach. The threat was the woman. Remove the woman, remove the threat. In January of 1355, while Pedro was away hunting, 3 of the king's men rode to the monastery at Coimbra, where Inés was being held. What they did, the chronicles record plainly. They killed her, beheaded her, by the accounts that carry the most weight, in front of at least one of her small children, and then they rode away believing they had solved a political problem. They had not solved a political problem. They had started a war. Now close your eyes for a moment and stand where Pedro stood. You come back from the hunt. You are the heir to a kingdom, a grown man, a future king, and you are told that the woman you love, the mother of your children, has been cut down in a garden on your own father's orders while you were chasing deer. There is no court you can appeal to, because the court ordered it. There is no law above the king, and the king is your father. Every channel for justice runs straight back to the man who did this. What do you do with that? Pedro's answer was to set the country on fire. He rose in open revolt against his own father, a prince making war on his king. Inés's brothers fought beside him. Think about what that meant in 14th century terms. An heir does not rebel against the reigning king lightly. It is close to the worst thing a prince can do, because the whole logic of a kingdom rests on the orderly passing of the crown from father to son. To take up arms against your own father is to attack the very system that is about to hand you everything. Pedro did it anyway. He raised troops, drew the great noble houses into the quarrel, and turned a private grief into a civil war that ran along the valleys of the north. It was not a long war, and it was not a successful one. The crown held the advantages crowns usually hold: money, institutions, the dead weight of legitimacy, and Pedro's rising burned out the way most risings do, short of its goal. There was no decisive battle that history remembers, no field where the thing was settled cleanly. It ground down into exhaustion. Father and son made a cold, formal peace, brokered by the people around them who could not afford a kingdom at war with its own future. They never reconciled. They simply stopped fighting, which is a different thing, and everyone involved knew it. And then they waited, the way enemies wait, for one of them to die. In May of 1357, Afonso IV died, and the waiting ended. Pedro was king, and a king can do what a prince only dreams of. The first thing he did tells you everything about the next 10 years. He went hunting again, but this time for men. 2 of the 3 killers, Pero Coelho and Álvaro Gonçalves, had fled across the border into Castile, beyond his reach, sheltered by a foreign crown. This is where the revenge stops being rage and starts being statecraft. Pedro could not simply ride into Castile and seize them. That would mean war with a larger kingdom. So he did what kings do. He negotiated. There was, in those years, a quiet exchange of unwanted men between the courts of Portugal and Castile. Each king holding fugitives, the other wanted, each willing to trade. Pedro handed over men sheltering in Portugal in return for the 2 who had killed Inés. He bought his vengeance with the cold currency of diplomacy, and in 1361, the trade was made. The 3rd killer, Diogo Lopes Pacheco, was quick enough, or lucky enough, to slip the net and escape again. He outlived the king's reach entirely. The other 2 were delivered. What happened next is documented by Fernão Lopes, the royal chronicler, and it is the moment Pedro earned the name history would hang on him. Pedro the Cruel. The Just, some called him, because his reign was orderly and his kingdom prosperous and at peace. But cruel is the word that stuck, and this is why. He had the 2 men brought before him, and according to Lopes, put on public trial for the murder. Then found guilty, they were killed. He had their hearts torn out of their bodies as he watched. One from the chest, one from the back. The reason he gave is the kind of line a writer could not invent and get away with. He said that men who had ripped the heart out of him by killing Inés were not entitled to keep their own. Picture the discipline of that sentence. This is not a man in a blind rage swinging a sword. This is a man who waited 6 years, who planned the geography of the wound, front and back, deliberately different, so that the punishment would say something. The cruelty was authored. It had a thesis. That is far more unsettling than fury, because fury burns out, and this did not. He turned an execution into a sentence with a meaning, and the meaning was, "You took my heart, so I'm taking yours, and I want you to feel the symmetry before you die." That is the horror of it on the surface, but notice the thing underneath. Everything Pedro did from the throne was an argument that Inés had not been a mistress. She had been a wife, a queen, someone whose murder was not a political tidying up, but a regicide in advance, the killing of a queen. Which brings us to the marriage, and to the second great gap in the record. After he became king, Pedro declared that he and Inés had been secretly married years earlier, in 1354 at Bragança, in the months before she died. If true, it changed everything. A secret wedding meant Inés had been his lawful wife. It meant their children were legitimate, with a claim to the throne. It meant the men who killed her had killed a queen of Portugal. But here is the uncomfortable truth the romance glosses over. The only real evidence that this marriage happened is that Pedro said it did. He named a place and an officiant. He produced what witnesses he could. And then he built the entire legitimacy of his dead lover and his living children on his own sworn word. Historians have debated it for centuries, and the honest answer is that we will probably never know for certain. It may be true. It may be a grieving king bending the law of the land to give the woman he loved, in death, the title the court denied her in life. Both versions are the same man. Both versions love her exactly as much. And now we arrive at the part everyone knows, the image that has launched paintings and operas and 600 years of retelling, the coronation of the corpse. The story goes like this. Pedro had Inés's body dug up from her grave, dressed in royal robes, crowned, and seated on a throne beside him. And then he commanded the entire court, every noble who had looked down on her in life, to kneel one by one and kiss the hand of the dead queen. It is an unforgettable image. It is in your head right now, in full colour, because it has been painted again and again, and it is almost certainly not true. Here is what the careful historian has to say, and I'm going to say it plainly, because this is the whole reason the episode exists. That scene, the crowned corpse, the kissed hand, does not appear in the contemporary record. Fernão Lopes, the royal chronicler who gave Inés 6 full chapters, who recorded the torn-out hearts in detail, who clearly was not squeamish about the macabre, does not describe a coronation of her body. The crowned corpse story shows up much later, more than 200 years after her death, in a play written in 1577. It grew in the retelling, the way a true grief gets embroidered into a legend, until the embroidery became the thing everyone remembers and the truth underneath disappeared. So the most famous fact about Inés de Castro is most likely a beautiful invention, which leaves an obvious question. If the coronation didn't happen, what did? What did this man actually do with his grief? Once he had the power to do anything at all. He built, he carved, he made something that could not be dug up and could not be retold into a fairy tale, because it was carved from stone with the truth cut into its surface. In 1360, Pedro had Inés's body moved from Coimbra to the great royal monastery at Alcobaça, carried by tradition in a torchlit procession that crossed much of the country, mile after mile of road in the dark. A dead woman, escorted like the queen, the court had refused to call her. Alcobaça was not a random choice. It was the burial church of Portuguese kings, the resting place of the dynasty itself. By laying her there, Pedro was making a claim in architecture that he could no longer fully make in law. She belongs with the crowned dead. And at Alcobaça, he commissioned 2 tombs, not 1, 2, matching masterpieces of Gothic carving, among the most beautiful objects medieval Portugal ever produced. Their surfaces worked with scenes from the life of Christ and the Last Judgment, every inch of them deliberate. 1 for Inés and 1 beside her for himself. And then he did the thing that should stop you. He did not place the tombs side by side, the way royal couples are always arranged, husband and wife, shoulder to shoulder, for eternity. He placed them foot to foot, across the width of the transept, facing each other. The reason, carved into the logic of their arrangement, repeated by the monastery for centuries, is this. He wanted it so that on the day of judgment, when the dead are said to rise from their graves, the very first thing each of them would see, before anything else in a resurrected world, would be the other's face. He could not undo the murder. He could not prove the marriage beyond his own word. He could not, in the end, even keep her body safe from the legends that would grow around it. But he could arrange 2 slabs of stone so that the architecture of his own funeral became a promise. I will be looking for you first. On the marble he had words cut that are still there, still legible after almost 700 years. Até o fim do mundo, until the end of the world. Now here is where you have to hold 2 things at once, and it's the whole point of telling this story straight. The coronation of the corpse is a legend, but the tombs are not. You can walk into the monastery at Alcobaça today and stand between them. They survived the centuries. They survived a French army that sacked the monastery in 1810. They are still there, 2 carved sleepers facing each other across an empty floor, exactly as a grieving king arranged them 700 years ago. That's the inversion this whole story turns on. We remember the lie, the crowned corpse, because it is loud and macabre and easy to paint. We forget the truth, the facing tombs, because it is quiet. But the lie lives in books, and the truth lives in stone, and only one of them you can still reach out and touch. Now come back to the silence I asked you to keep in mind. Inés's silence. The woman at the centre of all of this never speaks. We have Pedro's revenge, Pedro's marriage claim, Pedro's tombs, Pedro's grief carved into rock. We have the king's version of love, executed with an army and a chisel. What we do not have, anywhere, is her. Not one sentence in her own voice. The most documented love story in Portuguese history is documented entirely from one side, and maybe that's the part that should stay with you, because a love story told only by the survivor is also, quietly, a story about power, about who gets to write what a relationship was, after one of the 2 people in it can no longer disagree. Pedro got to decide, forever, that this was the great romance of a kingdom. Inés never got a vote. She was a political problem in life, and she became a monument in death, and in neither role did anyone think to ask what she wanted. The tombs are unbearably moving. They are also entirely his idea. Pedro died in 1367, 10 years a king, and was laid in the tomb he had built, facing hers, exactly as he'd planned. Whatever the truth of the marriage, whatever the truth of the coronation, this part is simply fact. He spent the power of an entire kingdom, making sure that the first thing he would see when the world ended was the face they had taken from him. They thought they had solved a political problem in a garden at Coimbra. They removed a woman to keep a bloodline clean. Instead, they made her the queen of a story no king of theirs would ever escape. And 700 years later, the tourists come for her, not for them. You can erase a person from a court. You cannot erase her from the stone a grieving man cut to keep her. They buried Inés de Castro to end her. He carved her a face that is still waiting for the end of the world.